Well, hey there, friend. Recently, I have had a bunch of people say that one of the things that they struggle with in watercolor is creating a smooth wash. So I'm going to share 3 different methods of washes with you today. The first one's going to be a wet into wet, a wet onto dry, and then I want to share how to do a gradient with you over here. So I've got a couple of colors ready to go. I have phthalo blue and a new color that I bought recently that I wanted to try out. It's called quinacridone fuchsia. And so anyway, let's get started on this quick little tutorial. So I've got 3 rectangles drawn here, and what I'm going to do with this first one is I'm just going to load it up with some clear, clean water. So I'm not going to be really persnickety about how neat that I'm getting the edges, because this is really just to emphasize how to get a smooth wash. Now, I'll say that if you are working on a subject, let's say that you're doing a flower or something that has a lot of areas that you have to work around, you can still do a large wash like this, but my suggestion would be find places in your drawing that you can break it up. In other words, you don't want to have to do a wet into wet that is, bigger than a dinner plate or something like that, because chances are, if you're painting within your subject matter and not a background, then you may not be able to paint fast enough in order to get the whole wash in before areas start drying. So just putting that out there. All right, so for the wet into wet, I've put my water on there. Now I want to let this sit. See how shiny this is? I want to have some control over this because I like to tilt my paper up and let gravity, water, and paint do some of the work for me. And if I have too much water on there and tilt it up, it's all going to pool up down here at the bottom, just like it's starting to do. So what I like to do is give the water just a few seconds to kind of start getting down into the paper and not just all be sitting on top. That way, when I go to put my wet wash onto my wet paper, it's going to still be able to move, but it's not going to be in a position where I cannot control it to some degree. Okay, looking at the shine now, it's still shiny, but it's a little more of a satin finish. And when I turn my paper up at an angle, I don't see the water puddling up down here at the bottom anymore. So I'm going to go into my blue, and like I said, I like to tilt my paper up and let the water, the paint, gravity do some of this work for me. So see how the paint is flowing down the page? That's making things a little bit easier. So as I was saying, if you're painting a subject and you're painting within the subject matter itself, you can still do this. You might just have to turn your paper in different directions in order to get the wash on really smooth and tidy. So see how it's starting to puddle up down here? I'm going to show you what I'm going to do next. Okay, so I've put a little more paint down here where this puddle is, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn my paper back up in this direction and see how that water and color is moving back toward the top. Then I'm going to tilt it to the right. It's starting to move down in this direction. Then I'll tilt it to the left. And what I'm doing here is moving that pigment within this water to kind of get it spread out evenly all over the paper. And I'll just keep doing this until everything looks kind of smooth. The water stops really moving. See, it's slowing down, but there's still a little bit right there and a little puddle here. So I just keep moving it around until the paint sort of starts to dry up a little bit, and when I tilt it, I'm not really getting puddles anymore. Still a little bit of puddling going on, not much. And depending on how wet your paper is, what the climate is like where you live, how much more water you put on top of the wet paper, lots of things will determine how long it'll take for your wash to stop moving around. So for me, it's probably going to take, well, so far it's probably been about a minute. It might take another 30 to 45 seconds, but things are starting to slow down a little bit. So I can actually just lay it down flat. And as you can see here, I've got a pretty smooth wash. Now, before I go on to the wet on dry, I want to get this dry because I'm going to tilt my paper again, and I don't want this area that's still wet to puddle up at the bottom and not have a nice, even, smooth wash. So hang tight. I'll be back in just 1 second. The first wash is more or less dry. It's slightly damp, but it's okay for me to go ahead now and work on the second one because it's dry enough. So the second one is going to be wet onto dry. So what we'll do is lift up our paper again, and the same idea applies. We're going to let the paint and the water and some gravity work for us. This is also called the bead method. See this little bead of water and paint that's right here? You're going to work that down the page. Now, what I typically do is well before I run out of that bead, I go ahead and start adding more of my paint into it. So I'll go down the page a little bit. And this is just the preferred method that I like to work if I'm doing a solid surface like this where I'm not having to work around anything. I'll just go back and forth. So I just added a little more, just work that down the paper. See how easily it just flows, and it's already creating a wonderfully smooth, beautiful wash. You can also work up and down this way if you choose to. Whatever is easiest for you is what you need to do. Adding a little more. Now, as you can see, I'm getting kind of close to the bottom of my paper, or the bottom of the area where I'm putting this wash. So from here on, I'm not going to pick up any more paint or water and put it on the paper, because I think that this will go the rest of the way down and fill in this little rectangle. And when I get to the bottom, I'm going to have a little bit of excess that's just kind of pooling up down here. Rather than turning my board and going back and forth and doing like I did before, I'm just going to take a paper towel and take just a very little corner and run it right through that little bead of water and paint that was right there. And we have our second wash. Now the next one we're going to do as a gradient. So I'm going to use the blue and then transition that into the quinacridone fuchsia. This time I'm just going to leave it laying flat, and I'm going to work wet into dry just like I did before. You can also do this wet into wet. I guess it just depends on what kind of mood you're in any particular day. So right now, I've got a little bit heavier mixture of the blue up there. I'm going to take water, and I've rinsed out my brush, and I'm going to start dragging this blue on down and getting it a little bit thinner. So I'm creating a gradient within the blue itself here. Smooth that out. Now, I'm going to come over here and get the quinacridone fuchsia, and this is a gorgeous color. I love quinacridone rose, and this is somewhat similar to quinacridone rose or even quinacridone magenta, but it is beautiful. I just love it, and I can't wait to try it out in a painting. So what I'm doing again is I've rinsed out my brush, and I'm just taking a wet brush and blending that fuchsia and the blue together. If it starts to get to a point where it looks like a blob of dark and a blob of light, then I'll rinse out my brush, and I may pick up a little more of my blue, just a teeny bit more water on my brush than paint, bring that down this way, do the same thing, get my brush nice and wet, have more water in my brush than color, and then come back up this direction and blend those two together. Just going to smooth this out down here just a little bit, just to get a nice, smoother little gradient wash. Same thing up here. And what I will do is have just a barely damp brush as long as my paper is still good and wet, and to keep from having like stripes where I was running my brush this way, I'll take my brush and go diagonally that way, and then come diagonally back this way. And that's going to help to get rid of any of the little stripes that may have appeared when I was brushing the color on. So now we have a gradient from the fuchsia and the blue into the center where they both get lighter and then darker on either end. Now something else you can do if you want to is you can just start with one color and come down about a third of the way, dip your brush into your water and take some of the paint out. Don't really swash it around in the water, just run it through the water, tap off some of the excess paint and water, and then start coming on down the page. Dip it again, rinse it off a little bit, and come on down the page. So what you will have in that instance is just a full single color gradient. So I tell you what I'll do. Let me flip this around, and I'll just work one of those right over here. I'm just going to do wet onto dry, just like I've done before. So I have the color here. I'm going to dip my brush into my pan, take some of the excess water off, bring that down a little bit further. See how it's starting to lighten up? Dip my paint brush in my water, allow some of that paint and water to come out, and paint a little bit further down, and then dip it one last time. And so now what I have is a full single color gradient. If it needs to have a little bit more color brought down, you can do it just as easily as that. So bonus, you got a fourth way to create a wash, and that's just a single color gradient. So I'm gonna flip this back around. We did wet into wet, wet onto dry, a 2-color gradient, and a single color gradient. If you have any questions, please let me know. I love to hear from folks if they have questions. I love helping people who are learning to paint in watercolor. And so anyways, if you've got any questions or comments, let me know. Have a great day.